So tonight I'd like to speak about the phases of insight. The phases of insight. And this is like the 6 ways to meditate. This is a map or a model, a way to orient to the practice. And it's, again, something that Emily and I have kind of co-created together in an attempt to better understand all the maps and models and experiences that we have encountered as practitioners and have seen our students and friends, colleagues and teachers encounter as well. This map, in a way, it's a kind of translation of an older Buddhist map called the Progress of Insight, which comes out of the early Buddhist tradition, and in particular comes from a text called the Visuddhimagga, which is one of the most, kind of the biggest commentaries on the early Buddhist tradition. It was written much later in Sri Lanka. I can't remember exactly when. But in that, there's a great section in which the author explores the process that one goes through, the meditator goes through as they deepen in vipassana practice, in mindfulness practice, and insight. And here, instead of the progress of insight, we're calling it the phases of insight for a very important reason, which is, in our experience, this path is much more like the phases of the moon, or the way that matter moves through different phases, solid to liquid to gas to plasma to, I think there's another phase now, even higher than that somewhere. In that, there's a way in which the 6 phases that I'm going to describe, seeking, effort, breakthrough, disillusionment, equanimity, and finally completion, are things that we don't just move through in some sort of linear, progressive way, one at a time, like a stair step. But they're states and perspectives of practice that we can enter into and then leave, pop into, and then fall back. We can move through them progressively and then find ourselves regressing, and then also cycling through these phases, actually moving through them, going from the beginning all the way to the end and then back to the beginning, starting a new cycle of these phases of practice. So there's a way in which they're both circular and they can be experienced in a linear way as well, where we move through them one at a time. And in a way, this talk will be kind of presenting a linear view, but just keep in mind, this is more like the phases of the moon, the cycles of practice. These are things we move through. And also keep in mind that the map is not the territory, or as someone else once said, the menu is not the meal. You don't want to go into, a restaurant and start chomping on the menu, even though the pictures look great. And so this map, it does its best to describe what I feel like are deep features of the spiritual path. But at the same time, it doesn't fit for everyone. All the details don't always work out for everyone. Human experience is very variable, and people are always breaking our models and maps by having different experiences. Anomalies, as they're called sometimes. So just keep in mind, if this doesn't fit your experience, you don't have to fit yourself into the map. The map is actually meant to grow with us, not the other way around. So tonight I'll be sharing a bit about each of these 6 phases, starting with the seeking phase. Before I do that, I wanted to share a quick story. I was on retreat a number of years ago in New Mexico with Trudy Goodman, a number of other teachers at this retreat center called Valecitos, and it's way out in the middle of this of this sort of very rural part of New Mexico, this deeply forested area where you have to drive in like 20 minutes through zero cell reception. So you lose reception and then you go 20 minutes more into the depths, and it's at very high altitude. And it's like an old homestead from like the 1800s. It's an incredible place. We're pooping and peeing in an outhouse. I mean, and we were out there with Trudy and a bunch of people from LA. It was very interesting to see people that live in LA, in these outhouses. Bless them all. And I had a chance to chat with Trudy at one point during the retreat, and I was sharing with her some of the stuff that had been going on in my practice, and what was new. And I was sharing this particular thing that was coming up. I don't even remember what it was, but at the time it was important to me. And I was sharing. I was like, I guess this is a phase of practice that I'm in. And without skipping a beat, without any moment of pause or even seemingly for her to like process what I'd said, she just said immediately, everything's a phase. Just like, boom. And I'm like, oh yeah, of course, everything's a phase. So in some ways what this map also is, it's a map of learning. How do we learn? How do we deepen our knowledge of things? So in the first phase, the seeking phase, there's a sense often that there's something that isn't right. Something's missing, something's wrong, something's lacking, and there's an awareness of that. Suddenly we become aware, oh, there's something not quite right here. I've got to do something to resolve this, to fix this, to respond to this. And that sets us off on a quest, on a journey, in a process where we are trying to figure out what it is and how to fix it. Now, when it comes to this sort of the existential journey or the spiritual journey, seeking, we find, I think, very quickly that this feeling of lack, this existential void at the center of our being, it's not actually resolvable through conventional means. Oftentimes when people start to feel this sense of seeking and lack and wanting to fill the void, they start to try to fill it with lots of things, right? Fill it with food, fill it with drugs, fill it with sex, fill it with love, fill it with, success. Something, usually out there that I can go and get and achieve will somehow fill this hole, will make me feel whole. And it just seems like that almost never works. In fact, a lot of times people start to seek when they have reached these tremendous levels of success. And then they go, wait a second, I thought somehow this was going to solve my problems, but there's something, I have everything I want. I've got the house and the this and the that and this. I'm still unhappy. I have all my basic needs met, even more. And I'm still suffering. I'm still fundamentally unhappy. So in the seeking phase, I think there are really two questions that the seeker at this point begins to ask. The first is, or hopefully they begin to ask, what am I seeking for? What is it that I'm actually looking for? First it feels like maybe vague and undefined, but eventually we start to get clear, like what is it that I'm actually looking for? Another way of putting that is, what is my intention? What's most important? Why am I here? And then if the seeker gets some clarity on that, then the next question which arises is, well, how do I go about realizing that? What are the means by which I do that? There's an interesting model that my friend Hokai shared with me. I still find it really helpful, called the hourglass model. And he uses this to sort of describe the way that the path unfolds in a kind of general way. And if you imagine sort of the basic hourglass that, it's wide on the top, in the center, it converges down to a point and then it re-widens back out. In the beginning of the path, and especially in the seeking phase, we're at the top of the hourglass. And so we're looking at a very wide open space of possibility. And in this phase, the impetus is really to find what works, to find the practices, the people, the communities, the tools, the resources we feel like we need to make this journey, to actually embark on the journey, and to have some chance of success. My suggestion for folks that are in this phase is don't try to find something too quickly. Like, give yourself time to properly research and investigate what's out there. I like to think of this sometimes as practice sampling. Going out and actually trying a lot of different things, seeing, what works, seeing what the communities are like, seeing how the power dynamics are, seeing, how they value things, how they actually live their teaching, which can take a little bit of time. Sometimes I also think of this kind of as like going to Hogwarts, the School of Wizardry, and you see the sorting hat, right? And the sorting hat kind of helps you identify where you belong. Are you a Vajrayana Slytherin, or are you a Theravada Gryffindor? I don't know. So it's like that in this phase. We're like looking for where we belong, to our spiritual home. Where is it that we can feel like we can relax into the journey and really feel like we have what we need to plunge deeper into the practice and through this process, going deeper into the hourglass. Eventually committing to one thing, which doesn't have to just mean one practice, but one approach. And here, as we do this, I don't think it's necessary to be intellectually closed to other things. My own experience as I went deeper into my own practice was I stuck with one approach and even one technique for a long time, but I was constantly learning about and studying other things. So it's sort of cognitively open, but in terms of emotionally, in terms of my actual practice, really committed to one thing, monogamous in that sense. And here I think one of the things to look for, especially in the beginning, is what approaches or practices will really play to your strengths. What can you find that will actually already fit with how you are? Because, when we find things that play to our strengths, it's just easier. We make swifter progress. We don't spend as much time spinning our wheels and then get kind of prematurely disillusioned. Instead, we can actually see some early and swift progress because we're doing something that fits, with our temperament or with our kind of personality. At the same time, as we play to our strengths, it's useful to relate to our weaknesses, to recognize, oh, well, I don't like this path, but it probably would be really good for me at some point to come back and revisit it. For me, that was the practice of heartfulness, of metta. And actually, I found it really quite useful even in the beginning to do some of that. So maybe even in the beginning, the seeking phase, we can start to relate to our weaknesses directly, especially if it helps us to be able to address some of our deepest confusions and weaknesses so that we can make the journey. Sometimes we have to do some remedial work before we really embark on this journey of exploration and insight. David Loy, one of my friends and teachers, he wrote that the sense of separation from the world is what motivates me to try to secure myself within it. But according to Buddhism, the only satisfactory resolution is to realize I am not other than it. I think this is interesting. So in the beginning, the seeking phase, there's a sense that some sense of separation, of isolation, of alienation, and we're trying to resolve that. And that's what motivates us. And we'll see how that leads to a full circle journey. If we're able to find the right path for us and we actually start to commit, then we enter into the next phase of practice, the effort phase. And in the effort phase, basically, the idea is to just fucking do it. Just to do it. Just to do the practice, to commit, to develop the habit, to show up each day, to develop the discipline. And if we found the right approach for us, this actually shouldn't, and we're clear on our motivation why we're doing this, it actually isn't hard. It's only hard, I think, when we don't lay the proper foundation, the groundwork in the seeking phase, when we're not really clear what it is we're looking for. So we're haphazardly just doing things. Or we're found something that we've committed to that actually doesn't quite fit with who we are. And it's just a struggle. But if we find that thing that really works for us, that kind of helps us begin the journey, then we can just do it. And I think one of the first tasks in this phase, from a meditative standpoint, and probably from the standpoint of any kind of real learning, is to develop what in the Buddhist tradition is called access concentration. Access concentration is what happens when our attention settles enough and becomes stable enough that the object of our focus actually enters into the foreground of our experience. Normally when we sit to practice in the beginning as noobs, we have a hard time staying with the object. It's like the distractions and the things that are happening and our thoughts and our feelings are in the foreground. And then the object is kind of sort of here in the background. We're sort of touching it and connecting with it here and there. Sometimes it becomes a little more to the foreground, but then we lose it. At some point, there is this shift, what in art is sometimes called the figure ground reversal. And the object, which was formerly kind of in the background, we had a little connection with it, but it's sort of hard to see and connect with, it flips. And the distractions and the thoughts and the feelings and the things that normally fill up our attention goes into the background. Suddenly the breath fills our awareness. Jack Kornfield writes about access concentration in A Path with Heart. Access concentration is the first strong level of presentness and steadiness that arises in prayer or meditation. When we attain access concentration, our spiritual practice for a time becomes unwavering and focused, undisturbed by inner hindrances or the mundane vicissitudes of life. In access concentration, we become merged and attentive in our meditation, so that a powerful shift of consciousness occurs, and clarity, ease, and concentration all begin to flow into our practice. So this is a really important hallmark, milestone in the practice, where we're able to really begin to notice what things are like, to begin to see into the body and mind more clearly. Now it's interesting here in teaching on these phases of insight. On the one hand, it is a more general map of what it looks like to learn anything, right? There has to be some sort of seeking, effort, breakthrough, disillusionment, equanimity, and then completion. In any kind of learning process, you could sort of see these patterns emerge. But this is also can be more specifically understood as having very particular features when you're doing particular practices. Like if you're doing, say, a mindfulness practice, these phases will take a different form. They'll look differently. Or if you're doing heartfulness, they're gonna show up in different ways. In linguistic theory, Noam Chomsky made a distinction in language between what he called the deep structure and surface structure of our language. And it basically means we can say the same thing using different words. right? We can say something that has the same meaning but using a whole different set of words, signifiers. In the same way, there are some deep patterns on the spiritual journey, on the contemplative path, that seem to unfold when we pay attention. But how we pay attention, in what way, also conditions and changes the nature of the learning, the nature of the insight, its qualities, its specific dimensions. I like the analogy of a multifaceted jewel. This is an old analogy, but Jack Kornfield uses this a lot. He said enlightenment is like a jewel with many facets. Each facet is a different dimension of awakening. And each practice and each approach helps reveal these different dimensions. You might have the dimension of pure emptiness, and the dimension of love, the dimension of unity, the dimension of selflessness, the dimension of service. All of these are ways of experiencing our own nature, our own most awake nature, our open heart and mind. But they look different. One of my traditions I studied in the lineage goes back to this monk named Mahasi Sayadaw. Has anyone here seen a picture of Mahasi Sayadaw before? Yeah, Adriana has. What does it look like? What does he look like? He's like an old baby, and he's pretty stern, right? Yeah, he's got he does look like an old baby, right? With a shaved head. But he's got this look on his face. He's like, it's like that's what enlightenment looks like in that tradition. And then in another tradition, it looks like, this guy or this woman. It just looks different, with each form that it takes. It takes a different form. So here in this talk, I want to both talk about the general features of the phases of insight, but I also want to give you some specific examples of how this plays out, in particular with the path of mindfulness, the path of mindfulness meditation. How does it look typically when someone does this practice of really observing, noticing, sensing in real time what's occurring? So in the effort phase, in this path of mindfulness, which as Jack describes it in The Path with Heart, which I really love, he said this is the path of dissolving the self. You could look at concentration as expanding the self. You're kind of deepening and widening and opening to this broader and broader and more open and spacious sense of self. But in the Vipassana mindfulness approach, we're actually dissolving the self layer by layer instead of expanding the self. So in this dissolving of the self process, in the effort phase, we go through various phases of effort. Access concentration is where it all starts. Once we are able to kind of drop in with our experience, then it's like the process really begins. The experience of access concentration, and I know probably all of you have experienced this actually on this retreat. I would be shocked if you haven't all experienced this. There's a moment of really feeling like we drop in with our practice, drop in with the object. It can almost feel like, if you've ever driven a stick shift, sometimes you drop down a gear and you kind of go, zoom. It's like that in practice, where there's a sense of just dropping in, and suddenly it feels like we're really meditating. And once we're able to kind of start to see what's arising, then one of the first insights that people often describe is being able to differentiate physical sensations from their mental stuff. Like to actually start to see thoughts and to notice that thoughts aren't the same as body sensations. That it's not just this kind of mass of stuff happening. There's actually body and mind, and they're all kind of rising and falling together. This is a pleasant insight because there's a sense of really clearly seeing something new about our experience. And then as we begin to really pay attention to the movement of mind and body and the way that it changes, we start to see the way that one experience tends to lead to another. That there's a way in which this is all sort of causally related. There's an intention to move, and then there's movement. There's an intention to think, and then there's thinking. There's fear, and then there's thoughts about how to get out of the situation. And that these things are constantly cascading through our experience, one after another, leading to something else, a constant moment and then a response to that moment that kind of continues to unfold. In the Buddhist map, they called this the insight into cause and effect. And as our awareness of this constant flow of experience, body sensations, emotions, thoughts, clearly seeing it coming and going, deepens, it also speeds up. We start to see more clearly, with more precision, more rapidly, how everything is coming and going and changing. We start to see in real time what Emily described, the 3 characteristics of experience. We start to see the change. We start to see the way that there's holding on, and then there's the existential rope burn. We start to see that our ideas about ourselves are just that. They're thoughts that arise and pass, feelings, that the sense of self seems to be actually be made up of a lot of different sensations. It's not just one thing, it's always changing. And in this phase, these insights can be very interesting, but also can be very uncomfortable, particularly in the physical body. It's like we're starting to get to know the change and suffering, but it's almost primarily physical initially. Many people in this phase of practice, they report feeling what's sometimes called meditator's pain. Where while you're practicing formally, you might, for instance, feel your neck cramp up or tighten, or your back start to ache, or for me, my forehead would get a lot of pressure in the forehead. People often describe a lot of heat in this phase. Their body's starting to feel hot and warm, like you could go sit out in the snow and melt some snow, like those Tibetan monks. And while everything's speeding up and we're noticing things faster, it also feels a little kind of clunky and ratchety and not so effortless. It's kind of And the real challenge in this phase is to sit with the discomfort, to continue sitting, to continue showing up, to continue making the effort to be present. And if we can do that, if we can stay with the process and let it continue to unfold and just stay present, even through the unpleasant and uncomfortable sensations, then eventually we start to enter into the breakthrough phase. In the breakthrough phase, there's this growing sense that the practice is doing you, not you doing it. And this is a great piece of advice that Emily got on our first retreat together at IMS from a teacher named Anna Douglas. And Emily went into the interview and was sharing some difficult stuff that was going on. And Anna's recommendation was just let the practice do you. Stop trying to do it. In this phase, there is the actual genuine experience of the practice doing you. Sometimes this is called the top of the mountain phase. It's like we're reaching the peak and we have this sort of opening vista of clarity, seeing clearly, seeing through the mind's stories, seeing behind the curtain. There's that analogy in The Wizard of Oz, seeing behind the curtain. It's not what we thought it was. There's something else at play here that we maybe intuited, but never really saw with this much clarity. This phase also is very much associated with peak experiences. 99.9% of the time when people come to me and they start describing some sort of peak experience, some altered state, some mind-blowing insight that they have, I think breakthrough. And it's interesting because these experiences aren't limited to meditation at all. Many, many, many people experience, I'd say vast majority of people experience these things outside of a meditative context. People have these kind of peak experiences during childbirth, during sex, while taking psychoactive substances, of course through meditation, but also through things like extreme sports, extreme events, life events, if you have a near-death experience or someone close to you does, or someone dies. All of those things can precipitate these breakthrough moments. And in a way, you could say they throw us right into a deep contemplation and deep questioning about the nature of reality. And so it can bring us right to this point of seeing clearly that there's something else going on here. And it's not what I thought it was. Often when you hear people talking about like a religious conversion experience, I think what they're often describing is a breakthrough moment. They had this sort of experience, this profound illumination and experience, and then associate it with whatever religious tradition they were connecting with, and sometimes even have the experience itself comes with imagery and connotations that they associate with a religion. I remember talking to this interesting fellow named David Frenette. He's a contemplative Christian teacher in Denver, and he was a Zen Buddhist practitioner and then had a Christian conversion experience, even though he wasn't raised in Christian tradition, and then he moved over. I was like, wait a second, that's like the opposite of what usually happens. Normally, people are kind of leaving their Christian roots and going, to Eastern traditions or to mindfulness or somewhere else. And for him, it was the opposite. He had some experience that led him in that path, in that direction. Looking at it from the point of view of mindfulness and how that path unfolds, dissolving the self. This phase of practice is often called arising and passing away. That's the traditional name for this stage of practice. I want to read this description from Mahasi Sayadaw, the person that I mentioned earlier. He wrote this in the Manual of Insight. He said, "Your mindfulness will become so strong, it will seem as if it rushes into the object that arises. It will seem as if objects fall into the noting mind. The knowing mind, too, will clearly and distinctly note each and every single object that arises. You might even think phenomena are arising and passing away instantaneously. Their appearance and disappearance are very fast, like a machine running at full speed, yet I'm able to perceive them all from moment to moment. I don't think I'm missing anything, or that there's anything else to be aware of." It can be that powerful in meditation practice, especially on retreats. We have this rare opportunity to have such a still and clear mind that it really can be like every moment of experience is being noticed, is arising and passing away, coming and going instantaneously. Shinzen Young writes, "No sooner is something arising than it's also passing away. No sooner is something spreading as it's also collapsing. Arising and passing, expansion and contraction, impermanence of space and time." So there's a chant that we're doing at the end of the evening called the impermanence chant. All things are impermanent. They arise and they pass away. Second verse, all things are changing. They expand and they contract. In this phase, we're really seeing that clearly, knowing that as not a conceptual truth, but as a direct understanding. And I love that impermanence of space and time. Two different ways to look at impermanence. Arising and passing is time, the impermanence of time. Coming and going, time. Expanding and contracting, space. These are different ways that change takes form. This phase of practice, from the meditation standpoint, often feels effortless. Again, the practice is doing you. So if the practice is doing you, you're not doing anything. You're just along for the ride, there to enjoy the show. In this phase, many people notice that they can sit for much longer comfortably. Their body is relaxed and supple and at ease. They may need to sleep much less than normal. I remember when I first experienced this phase on a retreat, the first retreat I went on, I was sleeping like 4 hours a night, and I woke up completely refreshed. I normally sleeping like 8 hours a night, so this is a huge difference. And that can happen. There's a sense that we have this sort of effortless energy, that we're not expending much energy. We're just kind of effortlessly noticing things. There's a sense in which the center of our attention is extraordinarily clear. It's crystal clear. Everything we see is with this amazing clarity. It's very altered. It's like a total altered state experience, often. And there can be this sense of a kind of witnessing awareness. You know, the sense, as Mahasi said, I don't think I'm missing anything, or that there's anything else to be aware of. If there's nothing else to be aware of, then often it feels like I am awareness. I am that awareness which is simply, effortlessly reflecting everything that arises. In the Zen tradition, they call this the mirror mind, the mind that effortlessly reflects and knows what is. My experience in this phase initially was that it felt as if I was somewhere back here behind, watching everything come and go, but not implicated in it. Like I was this timeless observer that was watching the stream of time come and go. In this phase, it's also quite common to experience all sorts of energetic phenomena. In the Indian tradition, sometimes called kundalini. Strong currents of energy can rise through the body, especially in the spinal column. Sometimes this feels interesting and good, and sometimes it feels overwhelming and disorienting. I remember on a long retreat one time laying in bed and feeling literally like there was electrical currents running up my spinal column. Like zzz, like physical. Zzz. I was like, okay, another weird thing to add to the list of weird things. Daniel Ingram, my first meditation teacher, wrote in his book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, however this stage manifests, the arising and passing is a major milestone on the path of insight. It's also a point of no return, since soon the meditator will learn what is meant by the phrase, better not to begin. Once begun, better to finish, as they are now too far into this to ever really go back. Until they complete the progress of insight, they're on the ride and may begin to feel that the Dharma is now doing them, than the other way around. The rapture and all the bells and whistles die down quickly, and the meditator may even be left raw, as if hung over from a night of wild partying. The clarity fades significantly, and endings of objects begin to predominate as they progress to knowledge of dissolution. Now we're moving into the next phase of disillusionment. Chogyam Trungpa writes, once we commit ourselves to the spiritual path, it's very painful, and we're in for it. We've committed ourselves to the pain of exposing ourselves, of taking off our clothes, our skin, nerves, heart, brains, until we're exposed to the universe. Nothing will be left. So, in the previous phase, what seemed like the peak of the mountain, right? Everything seems awesome. In this phase, it's the descent down the mountain. If you're unlucky, it's the falling, tumbling down the mountain, the other side. For me, it's the growing recognition of groundlessness, the groundlessness of our experience. As Daniel wrote, the endings of experience of objects begin to predominate. So we begin to become aware that everything is ending, dissolving so quickly that we can't actually stay with it. It's that fast. I was talking to David Loy about this one day. We were walking around Wonderland Lake in Colorado, talking meditation and Dharma stuff. I was telling him about, this word disillusionment and how I really liked it as a way of describing, what happens on the path. And he said to me, yeah, disillusionment is a good word because it assumes that, points to the fact that we were illusioned and now we're losing that. It's getting stripped from us, some sort of illusion. So in this phase, a lot of the ideas that we've had coming up to this point about the nature of the path and the journey that we're on start to become questionable, questioned. What we thought we knew starts to kind of shake. Who we think we are starts to shake. And this is where it can get kind of scary. We're in uncharted territory at this point. For me, when I'm speaking to people, and I often do, who are in this phase of practice, I tell them that the key to this phase, to unlocking this phase, is related to trust, to letting be, to letting go, to unconditional trust, actually. What is unconditional trust? Well, let's talk about conditional trust first. This is the normal kind of trust that I think we usually mean by the word trust. I also think of this as samsaric logic. Conditional trust has a kind of samsaric logic behind it. Samsara is this early Buddhist notion that there's this constant and ceaseless process of birth and death. From a universal standpoint, it's true. There is a constant process of birth and death. Whether or not you actually subscribe to the individual reincarnation metaphysics or not, we can see the world is a sort of ceaseless process of coming, birth and death, coming and going. In the samsaric logic, the idea is if this, then that. That's samsaric logic. If this, then that. If I get this, then I will have that. If I experience this, then I will be okay. If this person agrees to be a certain way, then we can be friends. If you treat me this way, then we're good. This is normal trust, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this. This is an important way to work in the world, but it doesn't work here. It doesn't actually work in this process. This reasoning, this logic keeps us spinning on the wheel. Unconditional trust, the key to this phase, from my point of view, or nirvanic logic, is if samsaric logic is if this, then that, nirvanic logic, just this, just that. Very simple, but very hard to sometimes realize. I think one of the things that can help us realize this more clearly is compassion. Because a lot of what we're getting in touch with in this phase is our own suffering. Yeah. We're starting to see the ways that we've been existentially tying ourselves in knots, expecting that if we have some sort of experience or if we achieve something, then we're going to be okay, and continuing to, try to seek and find an answer that never seems to fully resolve itself. Pema Chodron writes, it's not impermanence per se, or even knowing we're going to die, that's the cause of our suffering. Rather, it's our resistance to the fundamental uncertainty of our situation. Our discomfort arises from all our efforts to put ground under our feet, to realize our dream of constant okayness. When we resist change, it's called suffering. Remember Shinzen Young's formula? Suffering equals pain times resistance. But when we can completely let go, she writes, and not struggle against it, when we can embrace the groundlessness of our situation and relax into its dynamic quality, that's called enlightenment, or awakening to our true nature, to our fundamental goodness. And my experience is that compassion, which is, in some ways the quivering heart's response to suffering, this open-hearted response to our or other people's, or not even people's suffering, just suffering. This somehow allows all of the pain of our experience to be present and to be held by something bigger. The compassionate heart can hold it all. I had a direct experience of this when I was first, really getting serious about meditation. I was a sophomore in college. I just met Emily. I was meditating and getting into all kinds of weird stuff. And I remember doing this large group awareness training. They're kind of based on the work of Est and the human potential movement, where you kind of get together in this large group. There's a facilitator, and things like Landmark are kind of similar to this. And you're learning all these different kind of things and doing practices. Some of them are kind of contemplative, some psychological. And I was doing this really intense weekend, encounter type thing, and wasn't sleeping much, and really putting a lot of effort into the program and pushing myself to try to reach the goals of the weekend, and really had my full heart and mind behind this thing. And so I was meditating. I was starting to meditate, but it wasn't like the main part. It wasn't my main path yet. And I had this experience in this workshop. We were sitting down at one point and starting to listen to this recording. And suddenly, Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is going on, and then it switches over to a veteran, World War II veteran, speaking about his experience of the war, and all these kind of inspirational and moving things, just kind of one after another. And I was so open and so kind of like a sponge at that moment. I was really receptive to hearing some of these interesting perspectives, and I started to imagine that I was what would it be like if I were on the front lines of a trench warfare. I remember learning about World War I and the horrors of World War I, trying to put myself into that position, and with a level of vividness I'd never experienced. I suddenly felt like I was a soldier on the front lines, and I could hear the sounds of the battle, and I could hear the bullets whizzing and the bombs blowing up, and the hunger in my belly from not getting enough to eat, and the fear and the numbness. And it just became more and more vivid and more real, until I really felt like I was in that experience. And then it started to expand to include all of the other soldiers that were there with me, you know, everyone that's in the trenches together, and all the ways in which we were all confused and you know, scared, and yet, you know, couldn't go anywhere else. You know, all these things I was imagining, and then suddenly expanded to include not just us, but like also the soldiers on the other side. And not just the soldiers, but the people behind the lines, you know, that were, had sent off their fathers and brothers and sons to war, and who'd lost family members in war. You know, and the horrors and the difficulties and the pains and the, all of that, it just became so vivid and so real. And it was so overwhelming. My heart was just overflowing with this deep sense of heartbreak and aching and sadness at the human condition and at what we're capable of. And then at this moment, right before it, I felt like I was starting to identify and become more and more aware of all of human suffering, the whole like condition, the human condition. It's like the full catastrophe of humanity and all of the sorrows and pains, confusion, all kind of hitting me, hitting my heart full speed, head on. And it felt like right before, I literally felt like I was going to die. At this point, I'm just like bawling and bawling, uncontrollably crying. And all of a sudden, it felt like out of somewhere arose this literally tender-hearted, quivering response to the suffering of the world. And it was this deep sense of compassion, of holding the suffering, like embracing what was there. And it was equal to the suffering. It wasn't greater than, it was equal to. It was able to simultaneously be with. It didn't negate it, it didn't make it go away. It just made it fundamentally okay at some level. And in this experience, my sense of normal self, it was obliterated, it was dissolved. This was a breakthrough moment. And for me, it was just getting in touch with this sense of compassion, of great compassion, that also ended up being the key to being able to move through and with the suffering, to not get stuck on the suffering, but to actually find some place that could hold it all. Jack Kornfield writes, to let go doesn't mean to get rid of. To let go means to let be. When we let be with compassion, things come and go on their own. Things come and go on their own. In the mindfulness maps of dissolving the self, in the Buddhist maps, they have all kinds of stages of this process, of this journey, the disillusionment. First, it starts with dissolution, where you actually start to tune into the way that sensory experience is dissolving moment by moment, passing away. And then we also experience fear and misery, disgust, desire for deliverance. These are other stages. And then finally, re-observation. We start to, all the lessons and all the learning and all the pain and all the suffering all comes back and hits us at once in one big tsunami of suffering. That's how it actually feels. And in a way, it's good, it's necessary, because it forces us to let go. We can't get through it, we can't let it be without letting go. Letting go is letting be, as Jack writes. And so this phase really opens us up. It's a process of purification, actually, of opening, of melting away the resistances, of tenderizing the heart, of inviting us into a deeper intimacy and engagement with our life, just as it is. And when we're able to really rest with what is as it is, not trying to get away from it or change it, even when it's unpleasant or uncomfortable, then we enter into the equanimity phase of practice, where practice begins to happen all by itself. You can think of this phase as the calm after the storm. The storm blows through. What's it like after? There's a sense of relief, of ease, of relaxation, of appreciation. Oh my gosh, thank God that's over. I really appreciate my life. And the storm clouds part. We're left with a sense of ease, of opening, calm. And we're left, I think, really with a sense of ordinariness, of extraordinarily ordinary.
After nearly a year in private beta, the Buddhist Geeks Network is now open for any independent practitioners who want to engage in interdependent practice. You can find out more about the Buddhist Geeks Network by visiting buddhistgeeks.network. And if you'd like to join the community and join us in regular social meditation practice or other events that we host there in the network, all freely offered, you're very welcome to do so, again, by visiting buddhistgeeks.network. Love to see you there.